My name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Innovation Showcase. The main purpose of this ongoing series is to inform viewers about exciting innovations and creative individuals across the fields of business, science, technology, education, and the arts. Today, via Zoom, we're fortunate to have as our guest Dr. Andrew Lamb. Dr. Lamb is a retinal surgeon and an assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. He's also an award-winning author of 4 books, the most recent one being The Masters of Medicine, a fascinating account that explores the groundbreaking contributions of some of history's most influential doctors and medical pioneers. During the program, we're finding out why and how the book came about, and in the process, come to better understand and appreciate the remarkable stories of some of the most esteemed scientists and surgeons who revolutionized medicine through their discoveries, techniques, and perseverance. Let's start by meeting Dr. Lamb and then hearing all about the Masters of Medicine. Welcome. So delighted you're able to be here.
Thank you, Jay. Great to talk to you.
I learned so much from your book, eager to find out more and have you inform viewers. But before we jump right to that, I think it would be of interest if you'd briefly share just a little bit about your
Sure.
background, a little more, perhaps professional interests, positions, please.
Absolutely. So I live in Longmeadow, Massachusetts, which is in Western Mass, adjacent to Springfield. In my day job, as you mentioned, I'm a retina surgeon, which means I handle a lot of kind of serious visual pathology like macular degeneration. I fix retinal detachments, macular holes, and things like that. But before I went to medical school, I earned my degree in history as an undergraduate at Yale, and I was really passionate about history, to be honest. I studied military history and medical history during college. And I basically I feel fortunate that even though I've had my medical career, I've been able to pursue my passions for military and medical history. And my books are basically about those topics, essentially. And along the way, I've got 4 kids, 3 are now in college. I've been
Wow,
very involved in like Longmeadow local government. I'm a selectman in Longmeadow, and I'm really involved in historical preservation as well. So those are kind of my passions.
that's fabulous, fabulous. Well, moving on to the book, what
Yeah.
inspired you to write The Masters of Medicine? And then how did you decide which diseases and medical pioneers to focus on?
Great question. I think I'll just give a little background about how I even became an author. I think I joke that my high school teachers were probably shocked that I became an author because I don't think I showed much skill in writing when I was young, but it was my love of history that got me into wanting to share stories, and that's my passion as a writer. I was in a second year resident in ophthalmology at a place called Wills Eye Hospital in Philadelphia. And I remember kind of just during one ER session, it was late at night, and I remember daydreaming that it's just such a shame that I can't share all of the stuff that I studied and learned about World War II in China with other people, because that was my thesis, that was my topic in college. And long story short, I realized that even though I didn't have a time to write a nonfiction book, I was inspired to write a novel, which became a novel called Two Sons of China. And
Mm,
I mentioned that because I got a book agent for that before it was published. And when you have a book agent, you're constantly thinking about like, what else could I write about? Because now you have access, right?
mm,
And I had been a very historically minded ophthalmology resident. And I said, I've got these great stories of incredible unsung medical heroes who invented the techniques we use to do things like cataract surgery, LASIK surgery, how to even look into the eye, these
mm.
incredible inventions that were often spurred by World War II, frankly, which is another one of my favorite
Ah,
topics.
ah.
So I went to my agent. I said, I've got a great idea for a new book. It's about the history of ophthalmology's heroes. She was not interested. But I didn't want to give up, and I decided to blend those stories with my own memoir as a surgeon in training. And I think blending those two made it much more marketable. Became a book called Saving Sight. And so to
Mm,
answer your question about the Master of Medicine, ever since that book came out and was relatively successful, people have said you should do that for all of medicine. Every field has probably got these incredible stories of serendipity and perseverance. And I did think of that along the way. I was very passionate about another American story about Japanese Americans who fought with incredible valor during World War II, even though some of them had families incarcerated in camps like Manzanar. And so I actually wrote another historical novel called Repentance about that topic. But during the pandemic, when I had more time, I said, let's spend more time reading about these other topics, like in cardiology or diabetes. And I was blown away. I thought I was a very arrogant ophthalmologist. I thought that our field had all the best stories, and I was wrong. I mean, there's incredible stories of just incredible sacrifice by a lot of doctors who risked their own lives to invent the things that we use today. There was also a great deal of personal animosity, self-interest, and doctors and scientists, they're just as fallible and human as all of us, and they're susceptible to these frailties and base instincts sometimes, and that made these dramatic stories very human. So I did that, and I tried to make the Masters of Medicine very relevant to people by categorizing each chapter as a very important disease that's basically most like the seven diseases that are most likely to basically kill all of us,
Mm.
essentially. So these are conditions like heart disease, cancer, diabetes, infection that have touched all our lives and our families' lives. So I try to make that very accessible to the layperson, which is another passion of mine, just trying to make science and medicine relatable to people.
No, and you definitely accomplish that. But, picking up on your craftsmanship, how do you go about balancing the storytelling with
Mm.
the scientific rigor that is needed to convey the different diseases or disciplines?
Yeah, I think that storytelling is very important. I think I learned that to no author wants to write a book that no one's going to read, right? And so I had a lot of knowledge, of course, going through medical school and in my training about what are the most important things. And I think that the history is very important as a physician because it's true. And when you're in medical school, you don't care about the history. You're literally drinking from a fire hose with so much information. It's an infinite amount of study could occur. And it's not until later, like after I became settled in my career, that I became more curious, frankly, about like how did we get to this position? But once you've done that, you realize, first of all, you're incredibly grateful to the giants before us whose shoulders we stand upon. Um, but there are many. Our journals are filled with like articles written by doctors like myself that kind of cover the history, but not in
Mm.
a real way that's accessible to people. So I realized that to write a book that's going to be successful, you need to make it relatable to people, and you need to tell the story in a way that is dramatic and often simply tells the motivations and the thinking behind the people who innovated, because there were a great deal of setbacks and adversity, and it's essentially as dramatic as any Hollywood story. Many of these, I'm sure we'll talk about some of them, but I think that I balance it by making sure the story is paramount. Of course, the research is very crucial, and I did a lot of not only research from books that anyone can read, but I was also capable of studying the medical literature essentially, which I can go back like 150 years to look at a journal that old and look at
Mm.
how Garfield's doctors analyzed his gunshot wound when he was assassinated and his medical care, or Joseph Lister's articles from Scotland in the 1800s, and see, and I can understand exactly what he's going through. So that interpretation is a really important part of it for me.
Just picking up on that a bit, what were some, and I know could
Sure.
spend hours on this, some of the lesser known stories that
Mm,
really resonated with you when you
mm.
were looking in these different diseases or fields?
Sure. There's so many, but I'll tell one because it's kind of an homage to my dad, who was a cardiologist. Um, there's an incredible story of an intern in Germany in the late 1920s named Werner Forsman, and he is basically responsible for one of the greatest medical advances in the 20th century, which is cardiac catheterization. Now, if you're having a heart attack, interventional cardiologist can thread a catheter up into a coronary artery and just open it up with a stent, for
Mhm.
example, your coronary artery, and save your life. So nobody had ever dreamed of doing this. There was an intern named Werner Forsman, as I mentioned, in Germany. He was just at a community hospital, and he had this cockamamie idea that he could thread a catheter from a vessel in the arm to the heart. Now, he got this idea because he had read about it being done in a horse. I think he had like a veterinary journal or something like that. So he went to the head of his hospital and said, I want to try this. I think it theoretically could work. And the guy said, that's crazy. Conventional wisdom held that anything foreign in the heart would cause an arrhythmia and death. So he said, no way, you can't do this. And he said, Forsman said, got it. No, that's totally unethical. I understand. I won't do it on a patient. I'll just try it on myself. And the doctor said, absolutely not. That's suicide. So Werner Forsman realized he wasn't going to get like official like permission to do this. So he kind of hatched a secret plot to do it. He had to beguile this nurse who had the keys to the cabinet with where the ureteral catheter was and the other supplies. And he essentially numbed his arm, did a cut down, and threaded a catheter up into his arm. And you can imagine him walking down the halls of his hospital because the X-ray
Wow.
suite is in the basement, and this catheter's hanging out of his arm, and people
Oh,
are like gathering around, and there's all this commotion because they kind of know what he's trying to do because his story had been like put around the hospital. At one point, one of his friends thought he was going to kill himself and grabbed for the tip of the edge the catheter to yank it out, thinking he would save his friend's life. And Forsman had to like kick him in the shins and push him away. He got to the X-ray suite. He took an X-ray. The first shot was showed the tip of the catheter at the head of the humerus and right at the shoulder. He pushed it in another foot and a half, and the next shot showed it was in the right atrium of the heart, and he wasn't dead. So it
wow.
was amazing. And he he basically showed that it could be done, and that led to incredible advances after that. It was very rudimentary for a while. He won the Nobel Prize in the 1950s. He was shocked to get it. And that was just an example of a young person who didn't really know the risks. Like a lot of people, probably young people think they're immortal and can't, nothing can hurt them. But humanity really benefited from that crazy idea.
Most definitely, most definitely. What can we learn from an instance like that for the challenges we face today?
Well, I mean, I think it's very valuable to have young, smart, passionate people go into any field, our most important fields. I mean, you could argue those most important fields are political leadership is very important. We should encourage good people to go into politics. Medicine, no one has to be convinced of the importance of science and medicine and technology. Look at how our lives have changed even in our lifetimes. I mean, it's mind-boggling. What's different. My kids have never lived I tell my kids there was no internet when I was a kid and they think it's crazy, right? So I think that it's important to encourage people to go into these fields. And, in medicine, these discoveries are driven by, it's multifaceted. There's altruism, but there's also, ambition, glory seeking, and sometimes competition. There's stories like of incredible rivalry that spurred
Mhm.
invention, like in the 18th century, in the 19th century, Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur were microbiologists, who were basically competing with each other. And with the polio vaccine in the mid 20th century, Salk and Sabin absolutely pushed each other, and we got polio vaccines faster because of that. So there's definitely some negativity. There's plenty of stories, as you read about in the book, where people are not behaving well, and there were negative consequences from that, but there are also sometimes positive consequences. And there's stories of doctors who are just so selfless, stories of doctors who are so reckless, like Werner Forsman, and other ones of people who are just like you and I, imperfect people doing things in their own self-interest. But sometimes it spurs them to do amazing things.
For sure, for sure. Another point you make in the book that's fascinating and just adds to the storytelling is the notion of serendipity.
Sure.
Could you share a little bit about this and
Yeah.
that
People
is
love
a
the serendipity.
variable that impacts so much innovation, whether it's medical or beyond?
I'll share one story that some people will probably know a little bit about, but I'm also pretty sure that they'd love to know the real backstory. So one of the best stories of serendipity in medicine is the discovery of penicillin. Okay. So if you're not familiar with it, there's one guy who we all kind of attribute the discovery to, and that's Alexander Fleming, one of the most famous doctors in history. But the truth is, he doesn't really deserve most of the credit for developing this medicine. And I want to share about how the serendipity occurred, but also the unsung heroes who really deserve a great deal of credit. So in the late 1920s, Alexander Fleming was this microbiologist in London. He happened to notice after he came back from vacation that a petri dish that he had left on his bench, there was a wayward mold that had just floated into the petri dish, and he looked before he tossed it. He realized the bacteria on the petri dish around the mold were dead. And again, serendipity is amazing. There were lots of legends about maybe if wafted in from an open window, but most likely
Mhm.
came from a mycology lab in the floor below him, essentially. But again, this penicillium mold is so rare that it is one of the most serendipitous and most unlikely discoveries in human history, without a doubt. So, long story short, he wrote this up, but he didn't do anything with it. He didn't think it was going to be, he didn't make it a medicine. He didn't use it. He didn't investigate it for human use. It wasn't until 10 years later, these three doctors from Oxford named Howard Florey, Ernst Chain, and Norman Heatley, they were looking for antibacterial things and medicines that they could develop. And they read the paper, and they are the ones who, during World War II, developed penicillin as a medicine, which became a wonder drug. And what happened after this incredible antibiotic came out, the newspapers and reporters wanted to interview anyone who was responsible for it. So they certainly went to Fleming, who was by this time a kind of an older guy who liked the limelight. He was at the end of his career. He looked like the white-haired, genteel, erudite, everyone's picture of like a genius, a medical genius. In contrast, Howard Florey was this very kind of self-righteous and ethical guy in Oxford who didn't think doctors should ever do anything self-aggrandizing and certainly should not like boast in the press, right? So he was very cool to the press when they would call him for an interview. And what happened was the press started just ignoring Florey and loving talking to Fleming. And he would just give Fleming all the credit, and then Florey would get was the center of all the stories. Sometimes they would make mistakes and not mention Florey at all, or say that Florey was working under Fleming, which was totally untrue. And so that's why we all of the school kids learn about Alexander Fleming, but they don't really know about Howard Florey. And Howard Florey, Ernst Chain, and Alexander Fleming shared Nobel Prizes for
Mm.
the accomplishment. But anyway, that is just an incredible story, and that's one of the best stories of serendipity in medicine for sure.
Yeah, I mean, and that your book is filled with examples like that that make it so engaging, so appealing to read, and always great to hear the story behind the story that we're not aware of. You know, you've mentioned a couple already in conversation, some of the risks it takes to forge forward and make progress. How do you balance the medical progress with the ethical concerns, some of which that you've already mentioned?
Yeah, so we live in a totally different age than the time at which a lot of these dramatic stories were developed. You know, in the 150 years ago, it wasn't hard to kind of, I mean, the developments became like they were like sea change, like totally miraculous because we had before penicillin, there wasn't really a great way of dealing with a lot of bacterial infections, right? Um, Before Lister, people were just doing surgery and not didn't know what about antiseptic technique. People like a huge percentage of people who underwent operations would die of infections. But he learns that, you know, there are germs and we have to prevent them from getting into the operating wound, and that incredible like it's a huge sea change. So today certainly things are done much more ethically, right? So the cost of doing it more ethically, and I'm in a practice that is very involved in national clinical trials. We're doing a lot of research, and so you know there's a great deal put into informed consent. Things are done very carefully, um, and you know, we're not really making inventions that are totally changing, treating a disease that has no treatment. We're trying to improve treatments. And there are some great advances like mRNA, for example, or, you know, immunotherapy and cancer, and I'd love to touch on those. But basically, we're not really the discoveries we're making now are done much more ethically and are kind of incremental improvements. Still, there are breakthroughs. mRNA is a great breakthrough that led to COVID vaccines, saved millions of lives. But unlike in the past, it's not like we had nothing to treat these people with usually, you know. And of course, you know, we talk about it's fun to talk about the incredible successes like Werner Forsman, but for every Werner Forsman, there were probably 1,000 charlatans who did
Mm.
something bad, or harm people and weren't doing things appropriately. And so, without a doubt, that balance that we have today between ethical rigorous FDA phases, we probably lose some time. It takes extra time. Nobody's going to just go and try their experimental medicine on someone without like going through the proper steps. But it's certainly probably weeding out the bad ideas, and
Mhm.
and we're trying to do as evidence-based medicine as possible with the results, and only accepting ideas and drugs that are actually helpful to people.
Mhm. You know, did researching these historical figures change your perspective on your own practice in the
Yeah,
medical
for
field?
me, it was a great opportunity for me to basically relearn what I had learned in medical school, but to actually care about what had happened. It's like anyone who loves history. A lot of people, I loved history when I was very young. I don't know why. I just thought like every Civil War battlefield I went to was like going to Disney World. But most adults are like this. We work hard in the beginning when we're young. We do what's right in front of us and accomplish what we need to do. Like in medical school, I was just focused on learning so I didn't make mistakes that would actually harm patients, right? And I want to help patients. And I didn't have the luxury, I guess, of looking back at all the giants whose shoulders we were standing upon. But now, it is very gratifying, and you're filled with gratitude to these people before who took great risks to do give you the tools to save sight in my case, or save lives in medicine in general. So that writing this book was not work to me at all. It
Mm.
was just fascinating to go back and appreciate the things that they had gone through. Um, and a lot of doctors really sacrificed a lot. Some new ideas are often not well received by the establishment, if they are threatened by them. So there's a great deal of perseverance that goes into it as well for a lot of these innovators.
Oh, sure. And you bring those stories crystal clear for those of us who've had the opportunity to enjoy your book. Now that you've accomplished this, if you had the opportunity to have a conversation with one of the people you came in contact with through the research, through the writing, who might it be? I'm sure there are probably dozens, but if there
Yeah, that's a good
did one
question. Sometimes
person stick
the
out?
tables are turned. I interview for college sometimes, and sometimes I ask the kids these kind of question. Um, I think one of the figures that I wrote about that is probably one of the most fascinating to me would actually not be a doctor, but a patient. It's
Ah,
President James Garfield. Okay. So James Garfield was assassinated in the early 1880s. And briefly, in my book, I did a chapter on trauma, and I juxtaposed the assassination of Garfield with the assassination attempt on Reagan 100 years later. And the story with Garfield was he was shot in the back by this like obsessed, fanatical office seeker, essentially named Charles Guiteau. And essentially, the bullet didn't kill him. It was the fact that all of these doctors who didn't believe in antiseptic technique were examining his back wound by sticking their dirty fingers or probes into his back. He got sepsis and died weeks later. So it was just that ignorance that led to his death, frankly. But when you learn about Garfield, he was really a remarkable guy. He was like a guy who grew up in total poverty. Someone supported him to go to Williams College in our
mm,
state. And then
wow.
he became an attorney. He became a congressman during the Civil War. He was a general. And then he wasn't even seeking the Republican nomination for president at the convention, I think like 1880. And at that time, Grant wanted to make a comeback, and there was a bunch of other like more well-known people who wanted the nomination. But it was the longest convention in history, I believe. And it was like multiple days. They couldn't agree on somebody, and they chose Garfield because he was like a nice guy who everybody kind of respected, and he was like the figure that everyone could kind of get behind. And he was just from what I read, just a remarkable person, like a great deal of integrity. And it's just a shame that he was assassinated. It was only like 4 months in that his presidency was only 4 months in, and he was really into trying to stop the spoil system, to stop patronage,
Mm,
which was kind of
mhm.
poisoning politics. And ironically, like an office seeker is the guy who actually shot him. But basically, I wonder sometimes how our country might have been different if he had
Mm.
stayed. So that's one guy I would have loved to talk to.
Wonderful,
He was a
wonderful.
Midwestern. I'm from Illinois. He was from Ohio. I always have an affinity for a lot of Midwestern types and with Midwestern people and stories as well.
Oh, great example. Thanks for sharing that. What do you hope readers, especially outside the medical field like myself, take away from reading your book?
You know, I just hope people are inspired as I have been by these stories. I think it's impossible not to be inspired by these doctors. And I think if, you know, I'm always thinking about like young people education, and we all have wonderful teachers, and I'm grateful to many teachers who taught me writing and like surgery. Like, you know, the doctors who taught teaching someone surgery is requires a courage of its own, essentially. And I think that if only one young person reads the book and is inspired to become a scientist or a doctor who invents something that helps all of us, that would be the perfect outcome for this book. And I'm certainly hoping that many people are inspired to go into medicine and science because of it. I mean, and I still get, I mean, from Saving Sight and the Master of Medicine, it's very gratifying for me to get emails from people all over the world, frankly, who tell me that like they were inspired to go into medicine because of these stories. Not from me, but from the stories of the heroes of our fields that have that they've learned about from that. So that's very nice.
Incredibly inspiring. What are some of your current or upcoming projects? Perhaps
Great
a
question.
book or in your practice?
Yeah, I learned a long time ago not to talk too much about exciting new projects because the book, you know, things happen at in lightning speed in our life. Like the news comes out, everyone in the world knows it because it's on the internet. But books still remain a very long process. And
Hmm.
I remember I had one of my novels written and I had started talking about it in my book talks, but it took like several years before that book came out. So I am thinking about another book, but I'm also busy, you know, I'm enjoying like being a selectman here in Longmeadow and learning, you know, we're handling lots of mundane things, but important things like from tree hearings to dangerous dog hearings. I mean, sewer rates, you know, I find that interesting as, you know, to
Hmm.
be honest. The budget's coming up. We're gonna spend a lot of time talking about that. So, I'm not, writing is one aspect. I mean, I feel like as a doctor, it's very valuable to have other interests that you pursue because it's so easy to get burned out these days. It's that's a whole nother topic, frankly, physicians
Yeah, for
and
sure,
physician
for
burnout. And
sure.
it's really it's helpful to me, I think, to be able to pursue these other creative outlets.
How in closing, how can viewers and others perhaps learn more about your work and perhaps even get in touch?
Sure. I think the best place for me is kind of to go to a website I have called andrewlambmd.com. My email is there, and I'm always happy to, you know, do book club Zooms or I get speaking invitations, people who are interested in talks about World War II, medical history, or the combination of the two together. So yeah, that's a great place to go check it out.
Fabulous, fabulous. Well, most appreciative of your generosity with your time today, Andrew.
Um,
Continued success with future endeavors. Can't say enough about the book. And not only am I going to continue following your work, but definitely inspired to read some of your other publications.
sure. Thank you.
Terrific work. And thanks for inspiring. Me in these fields, and I'm sure, and I know many, many others. Continued success.
Thank you. Thanks for reading the Master of Medicine and for inviting me to come to your program. Appreciate it.
Wonderful. Also want to thank those of you watching for joining us and hope you'll be able to tune in next time.